Hello, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this webinar, How to Get Help from the Government's AIDS Packages. This is hosted by us here in FutureBox and together with our very good partner throughout the last at least 5 years, KPMG. I am Gitte, and I'm heading this incubator and accelerator called FutureBox during our normal daily life. Today I'm co-presenting with the Startup Accountant Guru, which is currently probably the most important person in this webinar, Mr. Morten Høgh Petersen. And we will get back to you, Morten. But just before handing out the mic to you, I will just point out your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of this screen. Please use the Q&A button throughout the whole presentations. While Morten is talking, I will try to interfere gently with a couple of questions, and at the end of the presentation, we will have a much longer Q&A session. Morten, we are very happy to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I will just switch over here to our slides on the situation around the government packages that have come due to the corona situation. And Gitte, just to be clear, I assume you can see my slide. Is that correct?
Yes, Morten, we can.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
And your picture.
That's great. That's great. So anyway, just briefly on what we will get into. Most of you probably know me from FutureBox. But I'll just give a very short disclaimer, because one of the challenging things with the coronavirus, when we talk about these government packages, is that some things are still work in progress, and so the purpose of the talk today is also to help you to navigate what do we know and what don't we know, because as I said, some things are simply not in place yet. And there are things also to look out for in this week, which have not been finalized into law. I have a very few points on strategic analysis. I will try to pitch that in based on startups situation, and just give a very brief narrative on that. So just a few minutes, and then basically I will go to the Danish health packages, which is what we will talk mainly about today in this webinar. Our thought was, if you do have some questions, then write them in the chat for Gitte to pitch in under the way. And otherwise, there'll be a Q&A session at the end where we can go more into detail on various questions. So just quickly on the disclaimer, as I said, most of you I have met before, but just be aware that what we are telling you today, or what I'm telling you today, is based on what we know at the moment. We have already seen, since the first government packages were announced 2 weeks ago, that there have been several changes. And so we have a lot of organizations, a lot of parties in society who are trying to affect the politicians. And therefore, very likely, some of the things that we know now and that we knew yesterday may change over the coming weeks. And already now, several changes have been made to packages. This presentation is based on the original packages that have been presented, and I will add a few oral comments where we know that the government has said they would change the rules, but we haven't seen them put into writing yet. So, for instance, there is a bracket for salary compensation that was increased to 30,000, which I'll just elaborate on. If we look at the big picture, and I think this is actually the most important thing, the government packages are not going to save the whole situation. It is a support that is mainly going to help a number of companies to get through a period of time, currently 3 months. But it is not, you could say, something that just completely saves your company. And therefore, what you really need to do, and actually especially in startups, is you need to understand the strategic context. I've put up a slide here which shows an influenza pandemic that hit back in 1968 to 1970. You can see, like today, that there were a number of countries affected, and you can actually see how these patterns had similarities across these countries. So what you guys need to do is you need to think about based on your specific startup and activity. What is the impact on your business? What is the impact on your current situation? And what is a reasonable timeline before the world will normalize? I must say, for some companies, we're looking into 2021 before a normalization. And for me personally, it is the situation where we have a vaccine or another solution. That is where we get the full normalization next year. And I'm hoping for that. I think it's realistic. And God damn it, there should be a lot of attention to that. But that also means that there's quite a long period here where the world will not be as it was. And even if we see a downfall now in Denmark where we get less cases, as you can see in at least flu, which is another disease, there is a second wave in the fall and so on. So I think if you were hiring a lot of salespeople, if you were doing things, if you're very sensitive to this, really think about the realism of hoping for good times already in a month's time. For many businesses, the realistic time frame now is longer, and you need to have some scenarios. What's a reasonable case, but what's a bad case, and how can we prepare? Many companies are already cutting costs and sort of laying in to survive the winter and be ready for the spring, which, as I said, may be next year for some. Also, some tech companies are totally immune, and we also have some early stage startups and tech companies that are funded. You're working on a development plan, and actually it's great. Your product won't be ready until 21 or 22, and you're almost insulated from this situation. But look at the strategic analysis. One thing that I think is specifically relevant for startups, we do know that bigger companies have many things to look at, but one thing I'm very concerned about for startups is contracts. You will have big companies, investors, suppliers, customers who committed for various things. They will be looking at cutting costs, at least some of them, and they might cut out your contracts as well. So I've already had several conversations with startups where they are cutting out the they're getting cut out their revenue. So if you do have some supplies or deliveries where you say this client, they will buy stuff in June, in August, really look at your contracts. Do we know they will buy? Do they have options to get out? There is significant risk that things that were totally stone sure in February are no longer anywhere near safe and stable now. So really be aware of that, because if you're manning, planning, producing everything towards that, and then the big customer deletes the order because they contractually can, then that can really put you in a bad place. So there's a lot of legal applications out of this that you need to be aware of, and I can only stress that you really need to look into that. Many companies will use options that they would not normally do. I won't say too much more about the strategic situation, but do some scenario analysis and really think about the situation and think about a timeline. And for instance, we have seen some companies that were just ready to go to the market. They were going to do a lot of marketing. They were going to hire a lot of salespeople. And basically, some of these companies have cut that back totally. Doesn't really make sense right now. It could be making sense if you're a very digitalized company, but for many traditional areas or markets, it doesn't make sense. Better to postpone it and use that energy at a later date when the markets is more normal. So what did the Danish government do as a response to this? Well, around the 11th of March, they announced that the schools were being sent home from the following Monday. Most private sector companies winded down. Many public sector employees were sent home. So the week after, around the 16th of March or something like that, we got all of these government packages announced, and that was made very quickly by politicians at a very high level. And this is extremely important when you talk about these packages to understand. The high level laws that were agreed in the Danish parliament were only indicative, and that's some of what we'll talk about today. What needs to happen once the politicians have agreed on something which is very general, then the officials, embedsmænd, need to build what's called the underlying law, and in Danish that's called a bekendtgørelse. And the reality is that the first bekendtgørelse that was announced is now 10 days ago, was this number 2. The second line about big events, not relevant for any one of you. Wednesday last week, you probably all heard about that. The third line, compensation for expected layoffs, was made available. So what does that mean? Well, it's actually not compensation for laying off people. It's compensation from the government for not laying off people. In Danish called lønkompensation. And so that rule is a very special rule, and the bekendtgørelse was made available on Wednesday, and also it became possible to apply the government for lønkompensation. So basically from the 9th of March to the 9th of June, employees that are sent home and that cannot work, you can get a cash subsidy from the government for hourly paid up to 23,000 per month if they earn more than that number. And for white collar workers, funktionærer, up to 26,000 per month. Now, there's been some discussion in the past few days around these barriers being too low. And I believe it has now clearly been said politically they will raise the funktionær limit to 30,000. If that is yet in the bekendtgørelse, I'm not sure, but it's definitely on the table. And in that way, many of these things will be tweaked over the coming months. My assessment is that is not very relevant for most startups, because the point about lønkompensation is people are not allowed to work. So if you send home retail staff, flight attendants, stuff like that, they go home, they don't work, you get compensation. In a startup where you need the team to work, this probably doesn't make sense if the programmer needs to be working. Then they just work from home. But if you have some salespeople, if you have people that you actually don't need for the next 3 months, then I can really recommend you look into this. However, you do need people that got a salary, right? So it's only if you had people on fixed salaries that you could do it. If you had some hourly paid timelønnet that got 10,000 per month, then you can be compensated for that amount. So it's within what they were earning already. It's already possible to go in and do the application for lønkompensation, but please be aware of the guidance around how you should do it, and one of the best guides I've seen is a company called Dinero, one of these small bookkeeping companies. They've made a very clear guide on practically how you could do the application. So that's a possibility. We don't know when you'll get the money. The Danish Business Authority, Erhvervsstyrelsen, has hired 500 temporary people. They have since Wednesday received 8,000 or 9,000 applications. They may receive, I don't know, 50,000, 100,000. So it could be some time before you get money, but the plan is they pay out now. And then you just need to make sure your documentation is in place, because if later when you have to prove it, it is proven that you did not live up to this, you have to pay back the money. So be very aware of that. The first line I didn't talk to, I have that on the next slide. So I'll come back to that. That is very relevant for all of you around VAT. So let me just come back to that one on the next slide. So the bekendtgørelse for line number 2 and line number 3 have been made available. And then we have this bekendtgørelse on self-employed. Now there have been rumors that that could be coming out today. I haven't seen the news lately. I don't know if it has come out. My personal best estimate is that it hasn't come out yet, but as I said, we're hoping it could come out today. The self-employed is actually quite interesting for startups because it's generally focused on companies with less than 10 staff. And I believe this limit will probably also have been raised to the 30,000, but we can look at that. No matter if we have companies where we have people that are, for instance, own 25% of the company and are getting a salary every month, then there is a possibility here to go in and seek compensation. One very critical thing for startups on most of these packages is you have to be able to prove that your revenue has dropped, omsætning. Now the problem is if you didn't have any revenue, how can you prove it dropped? And one discussion that we're having and that we're looking into is whether you can say, I didn't really sell anything last year or last month, but I actually had some good orders that I was going to sell here in June. And therefore we lost revenue due to Corona, and therefore we want to seek compensation. So take a look at your budgets, take a look at these things. If you are a company where you say, we're not going to sell anything until 2022, we're just burning investor capital, then you cannot get compensation. It is for companies that have been actually affected by the coronavirus situation. So if your company is not actually affected, for these programs, you're not eligible. I'll come back to some other things that are eligible for you. If you have people that become sick or go on sick leave, also due to Corona, there are some extended possibilities to compensate. I hope you don't have staff in that situation. There is another bekendtgørelse that's very important on the fixed costs. However, it's only fixed costs above 25,000 per month. I don't know how many of the startups on this call that have fixed costs above 25,000 per month. My personal view is that few of you would have large enough cost bases to go into this program. And you still have to prove that Corona had a negative impact. But it would typically be rent, IT licenses, and other things. And if you do come into this program, then you can get an 80% compensation on the fixed costs in this 3 months period. So it could be relevant. I think many of the startups, Futurebox, probably don't have enough fixed costs to qualify. But rent, leasing, IT licenses, maybe some consultants that you are fixed in with, but that you can't really use, maybe a marketing consultant, that could probably qualify into the base. Finally, go ahead.
Have a couple of companies also from the rest of the science park. So
yeah, sorry about that. Sorry. Sorry.
Bigger companies.
Bigger companies, but I would say definitely if you just have a number of employees, your rent and your IT licenses and maybe leasing cars and stuff like that, it quickly runs up. And so if you do have a cost base of 50 or 100,000 per month, this is super relevant. I mean, really look into that. But the bekendtgørelse for this has not come out yet. We're expecting it to come after the bekendtgørelse for the self-employed, and it could be next week. So it could be end of this week. I think it's more realistic maybe next week. There's a lot of definitions on how you do this that I think is creating a lot of trouble for the people who are trying to build the bekendtgørelse and the whole system behind, because they're also building an application platform that Erhvervsstyrelsen is going to operate with all these temporary people. But finally, on the last ones, the government also did something else. Vækstfonden, the Danish banks, there's something called the contra-cyclical capital buffer that the banks have been forced to save up for the past 10 years after the financial crisis. That has been released, so the banks are now allowed to loan out more money. Vækstfonden has received a lot of money, billions, that they can loan out. And the government has promised to go in and guarantee bank loans up to, I believe it's 70 or 80% state guarantees on loans. And this could be universally interesting for many startups, because if you can go to Vækstfonden, if you can apply for this government money, then then right now is maybe a good time to get these loans, because you can right now get a government guarantee for a big part of the loans. And that was not possible a few months ago. And depending on what happens, it may not be possible in the fall. We have a window now, and the banks in general should be interested, if they're going to loan out money, to get these state guarantees that cover the loans. So actually talking to your bank is a very good idea. Maybe you don't want to loan money in the bank, but you could create a credit line if things end up worse and you need capital for some more months. And you need to apply for that specifically. We're working on a small solution together with a company called Creditwire that are trying to make a very efficient application process. And just look around. I'll also present another calculator we have. There are some different services out there that can help you assess these things. But the loan specifically for startups is worth looking at if you do need financing in the foreseeable future. And to be realistic, angel investors, investment money, it will not be easier for the next year. It may still work out, but looking towards other kinds of financing, especially if you know that you will run out this summer, I would really recommend that you take a look at this as soon as you can. So just coming back to point one on the taxes.
Morten,
Yes.
Just before going from this one, we have a webinar with Vækstfonden just after after Easter, sorry, on exactly
Yes.
this.
That sounds very good, and I can only stress that that is super relevant. And to my knowledge, they have not finally communicated all these billions they got 10 days ago. How are they going to distribute them? So the timing of that webinar could be really good, because to my knowledge, the total clarity, sorry, of how you get into those, so on. Several banks that have been asked by some of my other clients, they couldn't answer. They're like, yeah, it's totally new. We don't know. So just go to that webinar, get informed, and be really up to the beat on what's going on, because there is a window right now, and I think actually Vækstfonden will have much more to say after Easter. And even if you heard them today, after Easter, the rules might have changed slightly. So sounds very relevant. I can really recommend that.
I can copy that, because we should have had it this Friday, just before Easter, but we agreed with them on Monday that we will postpone it till the 15th of April. And people are asking for a link and the date, and we will get that, make that available for you at the end of this presentation.
Good, great. Good, but then we go to the stuff on taxes. And so generally, just so you understand, VAT and payroll taxes is relevant stuff, right? You probably all paid your payroll taxes yesterday on the salaries for March. I'm not going to say so much about that. That's point 2. For April salary, May salary, and June salary, you're not supposed to pay in the taxes to the government. So talk to your payroll provider and tell them, we don't want to pay that in. You get a 4-month extension, and that means that the salary taxes, A-skat, AM-bidrag, for April is not due to be paid until May, June, July, August, and then you pay them end of August, end of September for May, and end of October for June. So you get some credit there. It's temporary. It could be extended. Right now, it's just for the 3 months. Then on VAT, there's been all kinds of discussions, and things could still change. But generally, VAT deadlines have been postponed a lot. And on the next slide, I'm not going to go through that, but you can see the more detailed deadlines for VAT. And the point is that if you have half-yearly VAT, you actually get postponement for all your VAT until 2021. But many startups may not yet have reached a point where you have significant revenue with VAT. So if you're not selling a lot with VAT, then you don't have a lot of sales VAT. You probably have VAT on several of your costs. So I find that many startups actually have negative VAT for long periods of time. This is really, really important to just think about, because if your bookkeeper, if whoever takes care of your VAT doesn't think about this, they might say, yeah, we'll just use the extended deadlines. Well, if you're supposed to get money back, then using the extended deadlines is actually a very bad thing, because you were supposed to get money, right? And the solution to this is it's not mandatory to extend the deadlines. We talk to some of our VAT specialists, and if you have negative VAT, we recommend that you follow the current deadlines as usual, because you are allowed to do that. If some of you really want to do more out of this, you can actually go from half-yearly to quarterly and from quarterly to monthly. Normally, you wouldn't ask for shorter deadlines. We've put in a link on how you apply for it. Just be very aware, it's binding for 2 years. So if you're going to sell a lot next year, maybe it's not a good situation, because generally these rules make companies that sell a lot with VAT and who pay the VAT to the government keep the money longer, right? But if you have negative VAT, keep to the current deadlines and you will get your money earlier. I did get some questions around corporate tax. LL8X, the tax credit scheme, very, very important for many of you. Right now, the expectation is that is not affected by these things and we'll get the money in November. So currently, there's been no communication on change on corporate tax. But in the same way as with the VAT, if you use the LL8X and you're actually getting money back, you don't want to change or extend any deadlines. You want your money as soon as you can. The final point here is you can now go into Skat.dk and then change the limit on your skattekonto to 10 million. And so if you owe the tax authority or will owe the tax authority, by changing that limit, you will be allowed to have a bigger debt to the tax authority, which is actually a good thing for you. So that's my final point on tax and VAT. And then I'll just do a quick recap on what we've been through. So on the self-employed, the bekendtgørelse had not come yet yesterday. It may come today. It may have come right now. I'm not aware of it. But the point here is that it has been a little bit unclear, but the Minister of Business went out end of last week and said owners of companies, the main shareholders who work in the company, who are getting salary in the company, they may qualify for this, okay? But the bekendtgørelse has not come, the application has not come. When it comes, take a look at it. And I also believe these people will be covered of the extended limit, which was 30,000. In the beginning, it was communicated that 23, but again, things are changing quite rapidly here. So that's very good, and this could be relevant. But remember, if you don't have lost revenue, then you're not fulfilling the base criteria to get into this scheme and several of the others. Yeah, go ahead.
Compensation for reduced sales. Can that apply if you have no historic sales to show, but for instance, you had planned sales this summer 2020 due to a product launch?
So that's a very, very good question. And I think it's going to be the most important question for many startups. So first of all, if you had a planned product launch in July and August, then right now the period was from 15 March to 15 June, 9th March to 9th June. If you're outside that period right now, then, you know, the current period doesn't even cover what has happened, right? I think there's a pretty good chance when we come to June that they will extend the period if the situation is bad. But right now we're talking about right now. So it's basically 9th of March to 9th of June. And so you need to be able to prove that in that period you did have something. And I would say where I'm pretty comfortable that we should work on it, or you should work on it, is if you have companies that actually had orders, they actually had emails, they actually got cancellations, because then I think you have a very good basis to go to the application round and said, I had these customers, I had orders for 1 million kroner that we were going to commence here in April. They have all been thrown out the window, postponed or totally canceled. That was due to Corona. I think that's a good argument. Just to explain the complexity. In the beginning, the impression was it was a very mechanical, what are your sales in March 20 compared to March 19? That would be very bad for many startups. Maybe you didn't have any sales back then. And again, you have to prove your sales are lower now, right? So you're affected by minimum 30% loss, as it says here, at least 30% reduction. However, it's my clear understanding now that there's much more opening of definitions here. So you could say, do I compare to a year ago? No, I might compare to last month. I might compare to last quarter. It might be an average or this or that. And therefore, I also believe that you should not just say it's not possible. If you actually have lost orders and you can prove it, then I believe you could try to make an application. I'm not guaranteeing that it would be a success, but I do believe that it makes sense. The big problem with doing this is, obviously, if it was linked to the bookkeeping and historical revenue, it would be much harder to do fraud with these government programs. Everybody, including me, is very worried that some scrupulous individuals will try to take out money from the government that they shouldn't have done. And so I can only tell you all that it needs to be fit and proper. It needs to be real arguments. But if you do have the real arguments, if you did have real orders that you lost, then I think you should go for it, because that lives up to the intention of the rule. And our impression is they've opened that up. But naturally, when we're talking about budgetary losses, it becomes much more fluent, and that increases the possibility to also do stuff which was not real, which would be illegal, basically. So I don't believe you shouldn't think about these things when you're looking at budgetary losses. But naturally, if your budget says you're not going to sell until the fall of 2020 or 2021, you're not eligible. I mean, some of the programs you can still use, but these programs generally are based on companies that actually lost revenue, right? Remember, it's the government's money that they're basically giving to you. So you have to have some kind of ill effect or loss from the situation. Otherwise, it was not their intention to help you. Okay, I hope that was answer enough. The fixed cost bekendtgørelse has not come yet. As was mentioned, we also have some bigger companies on the call. Really analyze your fixed cost basis. To this scheme, you also need to be able to prove that you have lost some revenue. If the revenue decline is very massive, so like a hairdresser, almost full revenue decline, then you can argue that or you can be compensated up to 80% of your fixed cost. So we have a number of businesses that have been sent home and they're getting full coverage. I don't think that affects very many startups, but if we do look at this budgetary loss and so on, we definitely could have some startups that could qualify for this. However, you do need to have minimum this 25,000 cost per month. And if you don't have that, then that will not make you eligible. The application is not there yet. The bekendtgørelse is not ready, but keep an eye up for this one for next week if you have enough fixed costs. And for some more traditional businesses, this will also be a very, very important subsidy, which I mean runs into millions and billions in the big picture. Then we have this compensation for expected layoff, and you can also call it for the expected layoff that you don't do, right? The løn, the payroll subsidy, and lønkompensation. And so this was what was opened on Wednesday. This is where they have got the 8,000 applications. And basically, it's a lot of these retail, hairdressers, flight attendants, all these people being sent home. But it could also be 2 salespeople in a startup that simply are sent home because we don't have any work for them. So take a look at that. There's a lot of employment law in everything that's going on. Talk to your lawyer about that. Unfortunately, some companies are also firing staff simply because they have to. This stuff about sending people home without work is temporary, and they might get a much higher salary. So we have seen companies where they have negotiated with people to go down 10, 20% in salary, but we have also seen a number of companies that have fired staff. And you need to make these assessments yourselves and find out what's right for you. Obviously, we're in April now, so typically the next deadline for looking at general staff is at the end of the month. But I would say here, I don't think it's so relevant for the early stage startups, but it could be very relevant for the very relevant for the scale-ups, and especially if you were just about to go onto the market, you might have scaled up your organization for a good times, and now it's bad times, and you need to scale down. And this can give you some time to wait out and see what happens. But obviously, the compensations might be less than what you're actually paying people, and then it's still burning your cash base. Good. Then I just have a summary here of some of the other schemes, and I'll do that very quickly. Wasn't planning to go through it, but we have these loan restrictions, so the banks have more money. We have the loan guarantees, and so all of this could be relevant to you guys. And then on top of that, Vækstfonden has received all these extra billions, and I might even join the webinar myself after Easter, because that is one of the areas where I really see a very big potential for many startups, simply getting accessibility to some liquidity in a very difficult investor market here in 2020. And hopefully in 21, everything will pick up, the stock prices will increase, the winter is over, and we'll look at happier days. I'm pretty sure it will be much better, and it will not take very long time, but maybe it will take a year. And I mean, 12 months for a startup is an eternity, right? So financing is probably key. Yeah, I won't say too much about these. They're in the slides. Keep up to date. What I will say, however, and that's I think how we best can help you right now, is we have made available on our homepage, you can search the word kompensationsberegner. So it's currently only in Danish, unfortunately. And this is a calculator not based on all detail, but based on the legislation that was made by the politicians. So it doesn't know everything from the bekendtgørelse because they are not ready. but it does include the compensation for selvstændige. It does include the compensation for fixed costs, and it does include the temporary lønkompensation. And within 2 minutes, you can just input all your own information and see what could you, if those facts were right, what could you get out? And therefore, doing that calculator and getting an assessment of the benefit for your company is very, very important, because then you spend time on doing applications if we indicate it makes sense. But if on your own basis, the indication is you can get nothing, then basically you shouldn't spend too much time on this. And maybe you should look more at the loan options or other things that you can do. We have made a specific email address, so those of you who work with us can actually just write your normal team. But if you don't use KPMG, and even if you use other advisors, you're welcome to send a question to dkhelp2020@kpmg.com, and we will, from the Danish audit practice, we have some very experienced people sitting that will respond to your email and come back on the phone and talk to you about what the calculation has shown and sort of what we potentially could help with. But the kompensationsberegner is free, it's open for everyone, and I believe by yesterday we had 8,000 or 9,000 people that had already used it. So that's very good, and as I said, it's open for everyone to use. The plan was to do a Q&A session now. I'll leave the other slide on, and I don't know how we should do it via the chat or sound, but that's sort of up to you to help me steer through some good questions here at the end.
Yeah, thank you, Morten, so much for this presentation. You have answered a lot of the questions throughout your speak. And I will please also invite people to write more questions in the Q&A, and I will speak them up loudly for you. I just wanted to go back to one question, Morten. So you said keep an eye out. Some of them are not yet ready yet. So can you just please say again, where should we keep an eye out? Of course, the media.
Yeah. So there is a government homepage. Unfortunately, if you search Corona now, everybody has bought Google AdWords, so you're directed to all kinds of different pages. I will gladly send Christina the link to the official government homepage that has all relevant information for all parts of the Danish government. Naturally, companies like ourselves are trying to help as well with our contributions. But I really recommend that you look at the official government webpage. I think it's at startvækst.dk, but I'll send the specific link so that you can all have that. I think the main thing that you should do now, if you're management in a company, is you should say there are all kinds of schemes. Use the kompensationsberegner. Could we even be eligible? If you find out you can get nothing, is that because we're saying we have no drop in revenue? Could we argue that we have a drop in revenue? If you cannot argue that, well, sorry, but then these things are just not made for you. I know Ehlers and other people are working to try to do something more specifically for the startup scene. My personal guess is the government looks at the Vækst Fund and says, we gave you, I don't know, 40, 50 billion kroner more. Loan the startups some money. That's where I think the possibility is. So if you're early stage, you have no revenue, revenue was years away, many of these schemes are probably not the right thing for you. But that's not bad advice. That's telling you to use your time in the right way. And if you did have budgets you were going to sell now, then I think many of these could be relevant and you need to look into them. But was that answer to the question, Gitte? So there is the one official government webpage. I feel that is the authority on all of these things, actually.
Definitely, it will. And we will join in that link with the presentation and the link to the recorded webinar so that you have it all together.
But it's not like a SCAT and Erhvervsstyrelsen and so on. It's one place. And then naturally it links out to them on their various areas. So I feel that is... and Vækstfonden and others will also put their links in there. So that is sort of the authority. But I do agree, there's a lot of stuff on the internet and it can be maybe a little bit hard to navigate.
Okay.
Okay.
Just one last question, also a little bit of wrap up. when you say fixed expenses, can you just
Yes.
again repeat what does that include?
Yes, good. So first of all, the bekendtgørelse has not come, and so if you do what I do, you have many views on what is the definition. But I'll tell you what I see as the definition. So what the government says for sure was a fixed cost would be rent. So you have a contract, you have to pay rent. So rent is definitely covered. Leasing, so you have a leasing car, you have some IT equipment, there is a contract, you have a cost, definitely covered. They are covered because from the government's perspective, you have these costs, but you're not able to make any money, so you don't have any operations. Now that smells like a more sort of normal operating company that has sales, like again, a hairdresser, they have rent, they're not using the building. A very interesting point on that is what about financial cost? And a very interesting question there. I got a question: is a paying back of debt, afdrag, is that eligible? That's for sure not eligible because you're getting richer by paying back your debts. But interest, renter, apparently seems to be something that could qualify into the cost base. Now that's super interesting if you have interest on the building that you own instead of renting it. So that puts the hairdresser that owns their own building compared to the one renting a building on the same par. Many startups actually have quite a lot of interest cost because you have big debts. But remember, you need to prove that your revenue has decreased, so you have lost something, you have been impacted by COVID. But if you do have interest costs, that's probably a very interesting area to look into. And then besides that, on more normal stuff, it is software licenses, if you have some expensive programs. But again, it should all be based on the assumption that you're not able to use these assets to a certain extent, and you are impacted by the corona situation. That is why they will go in and cover this. To be honest, Gitte, I would be very surprised if all our interest costs, let's say we have a startup that has 10 million of debt and are paying 10% interest, that's 80,000 per month in interest cost. I would be very surprised if that is eligible and is permissible under these rules. But that's one of the things I would really keep an eye on. And that could be very interesting. The problem with the way they've made these rules is that it's pretty vague. There's so many definitions. And every time you try to help someone, you risk helping someone you didn't intend to help. So yeah, I think with all my knowledge about this, I think it's going to be a really, really big challenge to make this work. But as long as you're being honest in your applications, as long as you're not hiding anything, never lie, I really do not see why, if you, when the bekendtgørelse and things come up, there looks to be an opportunity to do something, why you shouldn't try, but be very honest. And if the costs you have are interest on debt, and you believe from the information available that you can do this, then do it, but also state what it is. And let's see what they do. I mean, that's why they have 500 temporary staff to look at all the applications. But be very honest and protect yourself in your applications, because if you are caught not being truthful in this, they are also looking at making stricter legislation to punish those that are trying to utilize the rules. And I think that's really good. But there will be a lot of gray zone out there. I hope that was a good enough answer. So for me, the very interesting thing is interest cost, renter, and otherwise it's stuff that's on contract. And if it's not on contract, then the government would say, why should we cover this? You could just cancel the cost, right? But if you had bound up for a lot of cost that you cannot get out of, then that for me, in my definition, smells like fixed cost. And I would recommend all of you to already now look at your numbers. Pool together. What are your fixed costs in March, April, May? Maybe, for instance, if you had bought a marketing company to do a 100,000 kroner campaign each month of April, May, June, you cannot get out of the contract. Maybe that is a fixed cost because it was fixed. You cannot get out of it due to the contractual situation. You have something that is not useful and it's a bound cost. I mean, for me, even that contract could be a fixed cost.
Well, thank you for sharing your ideas and also your knowledge. That it was the most fixed answer we could get on that question right now.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, and that was also the last question for now. We will be hanging around for the next 30 minutes to gather more questions if you have more out there, and we will be sure that we answer all of them. We will also send out a recorded link to the recorded webinar together with your slides, Morten, and also with the link to the page that the Danish government put all of the information together on. And also there was an important email down at the bottom, dkhelp2020@kpmg.com. You said that everybody could use that, so I will also...
Yeah, it's just open on the internet. You just go to that link. Sorry, no, that was the email.
The email, yeah.
The hjælpepakkeberegner is just open for everyone, and the email is stated at the bottom of that page as well. So you can say, I did the calculation, I would like to talk to someone. And just to be clear, I mean, it's not like we can do the whole application for you instantly, but we very much want to help, and several others do as well. So send your email, and we'll be very happy to probably call you back on phone, actually. But we have some very experienced people who are much into the packages who are manning our hotline on that.
Perfect. I think that is one of the best takeaways also from this webinar. Thank you, Morten, for joining us today. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge for what you have now. And as you say, this is difficult stuff. It's gray zone, and the ink hasn't dried yet. But
new slide up, Gitte, because then I'll just leave it there. The next webinar slide.
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
There, and that's the last thing that I've got to say to you out there. Exactly, the webinar that we've been talking about is with Vækstfonden, and it's April 15th, so just after Easter at 1 o'clock. We will also invite you with a link afterwards, and it will be exactly on the packages that they have been put in charge of getting out into the Danish society. And we are working right now very hard to get a bank with us on that webinar as well. So sign up for April 15, and this was my last message. I wish you all a great afternoon, and stay safe.
Have a good day.